Voreth Sane had fought beside monsters for 11 cycles, and in that time he had learned exactly one truth worth keeping. Do not learn their names. Names were hooks. Names sank into the soft tissue behind his carapace where logic couldn't reach. And when the owners of those names stopped breathing, the hooks didn't come out, they rusted in place. So Voreth cataloged his allies by species, by function, by threat index. The Gren were siege meat, the Elsari were venom and vanish, his own Cathari were the war spine of any coalition. Vorse, four-armed and carapace-born and built for exactly one thing the universe kept demanding. He stood on the staging moon of Varath IV and watched the allied forces assemble across a plain of gray dust. And he counted the ways each species could kill. It calmed him the way other beings were calmed by music. The Gren heavy troops marched in blocks of 40, each 112 ft of bone-plated muscle that could crack a ship hull with a closed fist. Their footsteps made the dust jump. Behind them, the Elsari infiltrators moved in clusters that seemed to fold into shadow when you weren't looking. Directly at them, their venom sacs pulsing faintly green under translucent skin. A single Elsari could kill 30 hollow drones in silence before the hive even registered the loss. Then there were the Soltari. General Endara stood at the command platform like a mountain that had learned to think. Silicon-based, ancient, enormous. Endara had commanded coalition campaigns before Voreth species had learned to sharpen metal. When Endara spoke, the sound came from everywhere at once, deep enough to feel in the joints. Voreth respected all of them, respected what they were made of, what evolution had spent millions of years sharpening into edges. And then he saw the humans, 6 of them. They came off a transport shuttle that looked like it had been repaired with tape and stubbornness, carrying packs that seemed too heavy for their frames. No exoskeletons, no armor plating beyond a thin layer of something they called Kevlar that wouldn't stop a Cathari training blade. No claws, no venom, their teeth were flat and blunt, useful for chewing plants and not much else. Their skin bruised if you looked at it wrong. Voreth watched them cross the staging ground and thought, these are not soldiers. These are someone's lost luggage. The one in front was lean and moved with an economy that Voreth might have mistaken for training if the body doing the moving hadn't looked so fundamentally breakable. Staff Sergeant Cole Marsh, the briefing file said, Voreth did not intend to remember that name. Behind him, a woman with dark hair tied back in a knot was talking. She had not stopped talking since she stepped off the shuttle. She talked to the man beside her, she talked to the supply crates, and she appeared to be narrating the dust. Combat medic Lena Voss, she looked like she weighed less than one of Voreth's arms. The youngest one, a kid really by any species standard, was grinning, not smiling, grinning, the kind of wide, teeth-baring expression that among Cathari signaled either territorial challenge or brain damage. He hoisted his pack higher and said something that made Lena laugh, and the quiet one beside him, a thick-armed man carrying demolition equipment, shake his head without looking up. The last was a woman with short-cropped hair and a comm unit already pressed to her ear, speaking in what Voreth recognized as Soltari trade dialect. She also appeared to be insulting someone's parentage in it, which was Impressive given that Soltari reproduce through mineral fusion and didn't technically have parents. 6 against the Hollow. The Hollow which had eaten the Ferrex cluster. The Hollow which digested civilizations. The way a fungus digests a log, slowly, completely from the inside. The Hollow which adapted to every weapon and learned from every battle and never, ever stopped. 6 soft little creatures with flat teeth. Voreth turned away. The war briefing lasted 3 hours, General. Andara assigned sectors with the precision of a being that thought in geological time. The Gren got the central breach. Corridor meat against meat, the kind of fight they were bred for. The Elsari drew tunnel infiltration on the southern ridge. Voreth's Cathari were tasked with heavy assault on the eastern flank, 4 squads deep, rotating on a damage cycle. The humans got Sector 7 north, flanking position so far from the main push it was practically a different war. Afterthought duty. Guard the luggage duty. Voreth watched the human sergeant, Alcott, the one with the comm unit, translate the orders for her squad. She did it cleanly, accurately, and then added a word at the end that Voreth didn't recognize. 3 of the alien delegates turned their heads. A Gren captain blinked all 4 eyes. Voreth later learned the word was a human vulgarity so structurally creative that it had briefly overloaded a Devani linguist's translation implant. After the briefing, the one called Marsh approached Voreth. He was short, every human was short, compared to Cathari. But this one seemed to condense the shortness into something deliberate, as though he had chosen to take up less space and was daring the universe to fill the rest. He stood in front of Voreth, 8 FT of war-hardened carapace, and did not look up. He looked straight ahead at the center of Voreth's chest plate and spoke in a voice so level it didn't seem to come from a living thing. Patrol overlaps, Marsh said. Your eastern runs cross our northern perimeter between 300 and 500. We should coordinate. Voreth looked down at the creature, requesting a meeting like it was an equal. Your sector is non-critical, Voreth said. Sure, Marsh said. The word had no inflection. It agreed and dismissed at the same time. Coordinate anyway. Voreth agreed, mostly to make Marsh leave. The human stillness was wrong in a way Voreth's instincts couldn't name. Among Cathari, perfect stillness meant one thing only: something was about to strike. The attack came 2 days early. Voreth was in his command shelter when the ground shook and the sky turned the color of infection. The hollows forward. Swarm poured over the northern ridge. A wave of chitinous bodies and screaming pheromone signals. Thousands of drone forms moving with the unified purpose of a single, terrible mind. The staging moon became a killing floor. Voreth barked orders, slammed his helmet into place, and charged into formation. With his squad around him, the coalition responded. Gren roaring, Elsari dissolving into shadow, Soltari command frequencies humming through every comm channel at once. He spared one glance towards Sector 7 north. He expected overrun. He expected silence or screams or the wet sounds of soft things being torn apart. He found quiet. Not the quiet of death. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet that comes right before a jaw closes. The battle lasted 9 hours. It felt longer. It always felt longer. Vorath killed with a mechanical rhythm of long practice, upper arms driving the war pike through chitin, lower arms catching and deflecting, legs braced against the gray dust that was now gray mud. Hollow drones came in waves that had no gaps, no pauses, no moments where a soldier could breathe and remember what breathing was for. The swarm didn't attack like an army. It attacked like a weather system. You didn't fight it, you endured it and hoped the storm moved on. The Gren held the central corridor. Through sheer mass, a wall of bone and fury that the Hollow crashed against. Like water against rock. 2 Gren captains fell in the first hour. One dragged under by a massive drones. The other struck by a spear form that punched through her chest plate with the sound of a tree splitting. The Gren didn't mourn, they stepped over their dead and closed the gap. The Elsari vanished into tunnel systems. The Hollow had carved beneath the staging ground, doing their silent work. In the dark, their venom dissolving. Drone nerve clusters before the hive could reroute. An Elsari nest commander was consumed in the 3rd hour. The report came through comms as a series of clicking sound that Vorath's translator rendered as Nest 7 is quiet, reroute assets. That was grief in Elsari language. 2 sentences and done. Vorath's Cathari pushed the eastern flank with disciplined fury, his 4 squads rotating in and out of the kill zone as planned. 2 fighting, 2 recovering, a cycle designed to maintain pressure without burning out. It worked, it had always worked. Until the Hollow adapted. Halfway through the 5th hour, the swarm changed, the drones stopped coming in blind waves and started targeting officers, command signals, leadership. Cast, a Cathar squad leader fell with 3 spear forms buried in her communications array, not her body, her comms. The Hollow had learned what antenna meant. Vorath felt cold settle into his second heart. The Hollow was not supposed to adapt this fast. Swarm forms learned over campaigns, not hours. Something in this hive was different. Something was watching and thinking in a way that Hollow swarms were not supposed to think. His second in command, a Cathar veteran of 6 cycles, took a spear form through the neck joint while covering the squad's fall back to secondary positions. Vorath saw it happen from 30 FT away. The veteran looked at Vorath for exactly 1 second, one long clear second that said everything a dying Cathar would never say aloud. And then he was gone. Vorath sealed it, pushed it behind the carapace where the hooks couldn't reach. Not now, not ever. Comms from Sector 7 North had gone. Dead 2 hours ago. He didn't care. That was the story he told himself as his squads dug into the secondary line. And he told it with the practiced ease of someone who had been not caring as a professional skill for 11 cycles. 6 soft creatures, no armor, flat teeth. He had known what would happen. He had specifically not learned their names for this exact reason, and the fact that he could still recall the word marsh meant nothing. The name would go quiet like all the others and the hook would rust and Vorath would keep killing because that was the one thing the universe hadn't stopped asking him to do. The coalition held through the 9th hour and the Hollow pulled back, not defeated, not even diminished, but reconsidering, regrouping the way a predator regroups when the prey is harder than expected. The staging moon went silent except for the sounds of the wounded and the low hum of Soltari command frequencies. Doing damage assessment. Voreth's remaining squads reformed at the rally point, 40% casualties. Acceptable by, which told you everything you needed to know about. He was reviewing the perimeter reports when movement in the northern sector caught his eye. The human camp was wrecked, structures flattened, barricades torn apart and scattered like something had chewed through them. Scorch marks covered the ground in overlapping arcs that suggested either a coordinated defense or a very enthusiastic fire. The supply shuttle they had arrived in was missing its entire left side. The dust in their sector was darker than everywhere else, soaked through with hollow ichor, the black-green fluid that drones leaked when they died. There was a lot of ichor. 6 figures walked out of the wreckage. Voreth counted them twice. 6, all 6. Kalmarsh came first, moving with the same flat economy of motion as before, except now his arms from the elbows down were coated in hollow ichor so thick it looked like he was wearing gloves made from the dead. His face had the expression of a man filling out paperwork, not calm exactly, but operating on a frequency where panic had been noted, reviewed, and filed under later. Lena Voss walked behind him, limping. She was stitching a wound on her own thigh as she walked, pulling the needle through with one hand while the other held a blood-soaked pad against her ribs. She was talking, she appeared to be giving the unconscious air a detailed review of the hollow's anatomical weak points. Danny Prout had a piece of hollow chitin the size of a dinner plate tied to his pack with cargo wire. He was grinning. Voreth stared at the trophy, then at the grin, then at the sector behind them, where the ichor-soaked ground told a story that the 6 walking bodies shouldn't have been alive to contradict. What happened in your sector, Voreth asked. Meg Alcott answered without stopping. They came through the north ridge, 40, 50 drone forms plus a couple of the big spear ones. Your defensive position was gone in the first 10 minutes. Voreth waited for the rest, the retreat, the distress call, the part where they ran. Alcott looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has missed the point. We pushed, she said. Voreth pulled their sector's combat data that evening. He read it in his shelter alone with the lights low and his carapace still flecked with gore he hadn't bothered to clean. The humans had not held their line. Holding implied staying in place. Absorbing impact, enduring. The grin held. The humans had attacked. When their forward barricade fell, they had gone over the debris and into the swarm on foot. Chemical propellant weapons, primitive, loud, the kind of technology most coalition species had abandoned generations ago because it was inefficient and inelegant. The humans hadn't gotten that message. They fired those crude, noisy weapons into the swarm at close range. And when the ammunition ran low, the one called Ruiz, the quiet one with the demolition equipment, had gone into a hollow tunnel system that was still active, still full of drones, and placed explosive charges by hand on the structural supports. Then he walked out and set them off. The tunnel collapsed onto a hollow coordination node. 40 drones went dark at once. The swarm in Sector 7 North lost cohesion for exactly 90 seconds. And in those 90 seconds, the other 5 humans killed everything that was still moving. Voreth set the data pad down. He sat in the dark for a long time. TL, the Devani scout, found him. Later, she was small and quick in her bioluminescence shifted colors with her mood, blue for calm, white for alarm, a deep amber for the complicated emotion. Her species called recognition of something that changes the shape of what you thought you knew. She was glowing amber. They don't fight like prey, TL said. They don't fight like predators either. Voreth said nothing. They fight like something that decided to be dangerous, she said, and hasn't stopped deciding. The next morning, a revised deployment order came through from General Endara's command platform. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet reassignment buried in the daily logistics update. The humans were moved from Sector 7 north to forward advisory. Voreth read the order twice. He didn't say anything, but he noticed that his hands, all four of them, had gone still. The way went still when something in the environment had changed from background noise to active threat or active interest. He wasn't sure which was more dangerous. The forward push toward the hollows core node began on the fourth day, and Voreth found himself walking 30 FT behind 5 humans and 1 Devani scout, who had decided without being asked that Lena Voss was the most interesting person in the war. TL glowed a steady pale blue beside the medic, the two of them talking in a mix of trade common and hand gestures that had developed its own grammar over the past 48 hours. Lena talked about chemical compounds and wound closure rates. TL talked about bioluminescent signaling and the 17 Devani words for different kinds of fear. They found common ground in anxiety the way other species found it in shared victories. Voreth watched them and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for. The coalition moved in a broad front across Verit 4's surface. Gren in the center, Ilsari on the tunneled flanks. The eastern push. Soltari command elements coordinating from a mobile platform that looked like a mountain had learned to hover. The hollow resisted with increasing intelligence, its drone forms adapting to coalition tactics within hours instead of days, setting ambushes in terrain it had reshaped overnight, collapsing supply routes with targeted burrowing attacks. It was learning faster than anything Voreth had fought before, and it was during the tactical planning session on the 6th day that Voreth began to understand what actually frightened him about humans. It was not their softness, it was not their noise, their smell, their unsettling grins, it was the way they thought. The session was held in a command shelter with holographic terrain maps floating above a central table. Representatives from every coalition species crowded the space, grin. Commanders who had to duck to fit through the door. Ilsari officers who kept to the shadows by instinct. Kathvari squad leaders standing in rigid formation. General Endara attended as a projected presence, too large to fit inside any structure built for mortal-sized beings. The core node was buried beneath a ridge of fused biomass on the planet's northern hemisphere. Direct assault was the Grin proposal. Tunnel infiltration was the Ilsari proposal. Sustained bombardment was general Endara's preference, slow, safe. Geological. Cole Marsh stood at the edge of the briefing, arms crossed, watching the holographic terrain rotate. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes. The other species had stopped noticing him. The way you stopped noticing furniture. Then he spoke. Small team goes in through the western. Approach, he said. His voice hadn't changed, same flat. Level tone like he was reading. Ingredients off a can. Draws the swarm's active defense, pulls. The hollow's attention west, main force. Hits the east flank while the hive is. Focused on the wrong side. A grin commander turned all four eyes. Toward the human. The draw team dies. Some of them, Marsh said. The room went still. Direct assault on the core node costs. You 600 soldiers on conservative. Estimates, Marsh continued. The draw team loses 3, maybe 4. The rest of the coalition takes the node. While the hollow is looking at us. He paused. That's the math. Voreth stared at the human, not at the plan. The plan was sound, reckless by Kithvari. Standard, suicidal by Grin standards. But tactically sound. What Voreth stared at was the face of the man delivering it. There was no bravado in it, no death. Wish romanticism. Marsh had priced his own people's lives. The way a merchant prices inventory. Coldly, accurately, and with full awareness of the cost. You would lead this team, Voreth said. It was not a question, yes, and your soldiers would follow. Marsh looked at Voreth for the first time. His eyes were the color of creek water. In winter. Gray-green, clear, and absolutely empty. Of anything Voreth could read. They'll volunteer before I finish. Asking. Voreth believed him, that was the worst part. The session broke for 2 hours while Andara considered the proposal, and Voreth spent those 2 hours watching the humans do things that made less sense. Then the briefing. Lena Voss treated a wounded Kithvari. Warrior in the medical tent, the warrior was 4 times her size, his carapace cracked along the dorsal ridge, leaking fluid that was mildly toxic to most carbon-based species. Lena's hands were bare, she had run out of protective gloves 6 hours ago and hadn't mentioned it. She worked with instruments designed for human anatomy on a body built nothing like her own, adapting techniques in real time, improvising closures with adhesive compounds she mixed from field supplies that were never intended for alien biology. She talked the entire time. Okay, big guy, this part's going to sting, and I know sting doesn't translate great into Kithvari, but think of it like, you know, when you get dust in your joint plates, like that, but deeper. I'm sealing the membrane under the crack, see, because if I leave it open, you're going to leak out everything important, and I've already lost 1 patient to dehydration this week, and my pride can't take another hit like that. The Kithvari warrior survived. Voreth watched Lena walk out of the tent. Afterward, she made it 15 steps before her hands started shaking. They shook for 10 minutes. She held them in front of her and watched them tremble with an expression of tired familiarity, like greeting an old dog she didn't particularly like, but had learned to live with. She never stopped walking. The hands shook and she walked, and then the shaking stopped and she went to the next patient. In the staging area behind the command shelter, Danny Prout had found a young Grin warrior. The Grin was 17 ft tall if he straightened up, which he didn't because he was crouched on his massive haunches trying to learn a human hand-clapping game. Danny's hands were the size of a Grin's single knuckle. The Grin kept missing. His palms were wider than Danny's entire torso, and every time their hands failed to Connect. Danny laughed so hard he had to sit down, and the grin made a low, rumbling sound that might have been confusion or might have been the grin version of the same thing. They tried again, missed again, laughed again. Voreth watched this small grinning creature slapping his tiny palms against the hands of a being bred for siege, warfare, and something cracked in his chest. Not broke, cracked, the way ice cracks when the temperature shifts, not a collapse but a signal that the structure underneath was changing. Meg Alcott was in the signals tent, where she had been for the past 3 days. She had intercepted a hollow communication frequency, a low-band pheromone pulse that the Coalition's standard equipment had dismissed as background noise. Alcott had not dismissed it. She had been listening to it, recording it, cross-referencing the pulse patterns with known hollow behavioral data, building a predictive model of swarm movement on a handheld computing device that, according to the Saltari tech, officers shouldn't have had the processing power to run the software she was running on it. When a Kithvari signals officer asked how she was doing it, Alcott looked up with eyes that had red lines where white should have been and said, "I don't sleep much." She said it the way someone else might say they were left-handed, a fact about themselves that had stopped being interesting a long time ago. The draw team mission was approved at dusk. Cole Marsh briefed his people in the human camp. No ceremony, no speeches. Just the plan, laid out in that flat voice while the sun sank behind a ridge of hollow biomass that pulsed faintly in the dying light. Hector Ruiz nodded once and started checking his charges. Lena Voss said, "Somebody has to keep those idiots breathing," and began packing her medkit. Danny Prout grinned. Meg Alcott would stay on comms there. Voice in the dark, the thread connecting them to the Coalition and to each other. Voreth was not assigned to the draw team. He had no reason to be there. His Kithvari squads would lead the Eastern assault once the Hollows' attention shifted. He found Marsh at the edge of camp an hour before departure. "I'm coming with you," Voreth said. Marsh looked at him, that same flat, unreadable gaze. Why? Voreth thought about all the names he'd refused to learn, all the hooks he'd avoided, 11 cycles of keeping himself clean and empty so the war couldn't reach the soft parts behind his carapace. He looked at these 5 small, breakable creatures who were about to walk into the mouth of something that ate civilizations, and he realized that the hooks were already in. "You do not waste names in the dark," Voreth said. "I would learn yours before they go." Quiet. Marsh watched him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Welcome to the draw team, big guy." The Hollow's outer perimeter was alive. Not alive in the way a forest is alive, with roots and patience and the slow work of growing. Alive in the way a stomach is alive. Wet, warm, purposeful, and very much aware of what had entered it. The walls breathed. That was the first thing Voreth noticed as the 7 of them moved through a corridor of fused biomass that had once been rock soil and was now something else entirely. The walls expanded and contracted in a rhythm that didn't match any heartbeat. Voreth knew. A slow pulse that made the air pressure shift just enough to feel in the inner ear. The floor beneath their feet was soft and gave slightly with each step, like walking on something that was trying to decide whether to swallow them. Voreth led the way. His forearms held 2 warpikes and 2 shield bracers, and his carapace scraped the ceiling when the corridor narrowed. Behind him, Cole Marsh moved in silence. His weapon up, his breathing so controlled it sounded mechanical. Lena Voss walked with her medkit on one hip and a sidearm on the other. And for the first time since Vorlag had met her, she was not talking. Her jaw was set in a way that pushed her lower teeth forward, and her eyes moved in patterns. Door, ceiling, floor, team, door. That Vorlag recognized as combat scanning. Danny Prout covered the rear with Hector Ruiz. Tail moved between them like light between shadows. Her bioluminescence dimmed to almost nothing, a faint amber glow that pulsed. When her anxiety spiked, it spiked often. "It knows we're here," Marsh said, not a question. Vorlag's antennae confirmed it. The hollow's pheromone signals were thick in the air, a chemical language that said found. In overlapping waves, drones were being redirected toward their corridor. He could feel the vibrations through the floor. "It is hurting us," Vorlag said. "Good," Marsh said. Vorlag turned one eye toward the human. "If it's hurting us," Marsh said, "it's not watching the east flank. That's where Undara hits." The logic was correct. The tone was what disturbed Vorlag. Marsh said it the way a person says, "That's where I parked the car." Factual, disposable, not worth emotional investment. The seven of them were bait, and the bait was speaking about itself in the third person. They moved deeper. Hector Ruiz set charges at structural nodes as they went, silent, efficient. His stick hands working with a precision that contradicted their size. Each charge was placed at a junction point in the hollow's biomass architecture, where the organic walls met and formed load-bearing connections. If the charges fired in sequence, the entire outer structure would fold inward. If the timing was wrong by more than 4 seconds, the charges would fold inward on the team instead. Vorlag watched Hector work. The man's hands were steady. His breathing was not. A slight unevenness in the rhythm. Catch at the top of each inhale that said the body knew exactly what it was doing and had opinions about it that the hands had overruled. They were 2 km inside the perimeter when the hollow stopped hurting and started screaming. Not sound, not vibration. Something older, deeper, aimed directly at the place where thought became feeling. A neural attack. A focused blast of pheromone and electromagnetic pulse that targeted the fear centers of organic brains. A weapon the hollow had refined over thousands of years of consuming species who were afraid of the dark. 20 years of mental conditioning, neurochemical dampening, carapace sealed, meditation techniques designed to wall off the fear response before it could reach the motor functions. He had practiced this defense 1,000 times. He stumbled, his lower legs buckled, and for a half-second the universe became a narrow tunnel of animal terror, the walls closing, the floor opening, every shadow growing teeth. His training caught it, held it, forced it back behind the carapace with the mechanical precision of long discipline. He recovered in 3 seconds, fast by Keth Vari standards. Elite-level response time. The humans had hit the floor, all 5 of them. Danny went to one knee, his grin gone for the first time, his face white, his hands flat on the pulsing ground. Lena made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and bent forward at the waist with her hands on her knees, Marsh closed his eyes, tail curled into a ball, her bioluminescence flaring white-hot with pure panic. Vorlag braced himself. This was the moment he had expected, since he first saw them walk off that damaged shuttle. The soft ones break. The soft ones always break. And in the hollow's perimeter, breaking meant dying because the drones were already coming. He could hear them chittering in the corridor behind, drawn by the scream, by the blood smell of fear. 2 seconds passed. Lena straightened. She wiped her mouth. With the back of her hand, scooped tail off the ground and tucked the scout against her chest in one arm. Her other hand held her side arm. Her face looked like she'd just been in. Was different now, not the easy, boyish thing from the staging moon, but something thinner, sharper, worn like armor rather than amusement. Hector blinked and his hands started moving again, reaching for the next charge like nothing had happened. Marsh opened his eyes. He checked his team, one glance at each, counting limbs and breathing, and turned back to the corridor ahead. 4 seconds, all 5 of them functional, moving. Vorlag had seen Bren warriors, 12 FT. Beings bred and trained for war since birth, freeze under the hollow's neural scream for 30 seconds or more. Some never recovered at all, locked in a loop of primal terror until the drones found them. The humans had shaken it off like walking through rain. How? Vorlag asked. He didn't mean to ask. The word left him before the decision to speak it had finished forming. Marsh didn't look back. We live with that feeling. You just gave it a new name. Vorlag heard the words. He understood the words. And something behind his carapace, in the place where the hooks lived, shifted in a way that had nothing to do with fear. They reached the outer node. The hollow manifested a warden form too. Stop them, a construct of fused biomass, the size of a Bren-heavy trooper, all bladed limbs and layered chitin bill, specifically to kill whatever had reached this deep. It stepped out of the wall like the architecture itself had decided to become hostile, and it moved with a speed that something that large should not have been able to move. Vorlag met it head-on, all 4 arms working, pike striking, bracers catching, his carapace taking hits that rang through his skeleton like bells. He had fought warden forms before. They were strong and fast and terrible, and they could be killed if you knew where. The joints were soft. He didn't have to do it alone. Marsh flanked left, Danny flanked right. They moved around the warden form like water around a stone, firing at joint points and sensory clusters, their primitive weapons making up in accuracy what they lacked in power. The warden form turned to swipe at Danny, a bladed arm that would have cut the boy in half, and Marsh put 3 rounds into the exposed joint and the arm faltered, and Vorlag drove his pike into the gap. Behind them the drones came. Lena set tail down, put a surgical tool in her left hand and her side arm in her right, and became something Vorlag had never seen a medic become. She didn't fight the way a soldier fights, organized, directed, purposeful. She fought the way an animal fights when its young are behind it, messy, raw. Every movement aimed at the single goal of keeping the small glowing body at her feet alive. Hector placed the last charge. The warden form came apart under Vorlag's pikes and the human's crossfire, its biomass spilling across the floor in a steaming heap. Move, Marsh said, now. They ran. Back through the corridor, past the breathing walls and the pulsing floor, past a dozen drone forms that Vorlag and Danny cut through without slowing. Behind them, the charges began their sequence, timed, precise. Hector's meticulous hands translated into a pattern of destruction. Hector took the hit, 30 from the exit. A drone spear form fired from a wall-mounted node they hadn't seen punched through his left side below the ribs. Lena was there before he finished falling, her hands already working, her voice back, rapid, technical, a stream of words that were part medical terminology and part profanity and part something that sounded like begging. Move, Marsh said again. The word meant something different now. Not a command to the team, but a plea to the universe. The math said leave him. The mission math, the draw team math. The cold equation Marsh had laid out in the briefing room. 3, maybe 4. The math had always included this possibility. This was the cost Marsh had priced. Nobody moved toward the exit. Danny took a position at the corridor mouth and fired into the dark. Marsh covered the opposite angle. Vorlag stood over Lena and Hector like a wall, the real kind made of armor and will, and killed everything that came within reach of his pikes. Got it, Lena said. Her voice cracked on the second word. He moves now or not at all. Vorlag reached down with his 2 lower arms and picked Hector Ruiz off the ground the way a parent picks up a child. The man weighed nothing. All humans weighed nothing. The demolition's equipment on his back weighed more than he did. The charges blew. The corridor folded, the walls screamed. A real sound this time, not a neural weapon, but the noise of a living structure being torn apart from the inside. Voreth ran. He carried the human 300 through collapsing architecture, through dust and debris and the shrieking death of a hollow node that had stood for centuries. And the entire time he felt the small body in his arms breathing, shallow, uneven but breathing. They made it out, all 7 of them, because Lena Voss had looked at the math and decided it was wrong. The core node fell on the 8th day, with the hollow's outer defenses collapsed and its attention fractured westward by a draw team that should have been dead. General Andara's main force punched through the weakened eastern flank with the slow grinding inevitability of a glacier. The Gren led the breach. The Ilsari poured into the tunnel systems and dissolved the hollows internal communication network from the inside. Voreth's Kithvari squads drove the final push into the core chamber itself, where the hive mind central mass pulsed with the accumulated intelligence of 1,000 consumed worlds. It died the way all things die when they are large and old and have forgotten what it means to be afraid. It died. Confused. Thureth 4 was quiet after that. The wrong kind of quiet, not peace, but exhaustion. The ground was scorched and scarred and soaked with fluids from a dozen species, and the sky had a haze too. It that wouldn't clear for months. Thin veil of particulate that was partly dust and partly the remains of things that had been alive 8 days ago. The coalition held a muster on the staging plane where it had all started. Species that had arrived in organized formations now stood in ragged clusters, the gaps in their ranks speaking louder than any casualty report. The Gren had lost 1/3 of their force, the Ilsari had lost 2 full nests, the Kithvari had lost 44% across all squads, and Voreth felt each absence as a cold spot on the map of his awareness, places where signals should have been and weren't. The humans had lost no one. Voreth sat in his shelter that evening and tried to write his battle report. The document was a standard coalition form, species assessment, tactical contribution, combat rating recommended, future deployment. He had filled out hundreds of these. Species reduced to data, contributions measured in kill counts, and territory held. Recommendations expressed in the efficient clinical language the coalition used to talk about death without actually saying the word. He reached the section on the human contingent and stopped writing. The cursor blinked on an empty field. Species assessment. What were they? How did he categorize what he had seen? He put the report aside. Instead, he walked to the human camp. It was smaller than any other species. Staging area, 6 people didn't need much space. And in the low evening light it looked almost accidental, like something that had grown rather than been built. Salvaged crates served as chairs. A piece of whole plating from their damaged shuttle had been propped against 2 supply containers to make a lean-to. Someone had strung a small chemical light from a cargo strap, and it swung in the faint breeze, casting a warm circle of yellow that felt like a word in a language Voreth didn't speak. Danny Prout was sitting cross-legged on a crate, teaching the young Gren warrior a card game. The cards were small and battered, and had been printed on what appeared to be recycled ration packaging. The Gren held his cards in one massive fist. His entire hand was larger than the playing surface, and he kept dropping them. And each time he did, Danny laughed and helped him pick them up and arrange them again with the careful patience of someone who understood that the game was not the point. The Gren rumbled something in his deep, tectonic voice. Danny didn't understand the words, but he nodded anyway and dealt another hand. Meg Alcott was asleep. She sat upright against a supply crate with her head tilted back and her mouth slightly open, one hand still resting on her comm unit, the fingers loosely curled around it as though even unconsciousness couldn't fully release her grip on the thread that connected her to everything. Her face in sleep looked older than it did when she was awake. The lines around her eyes were deeper. The tension in her jaw was gone. And, without it, her face looked unfamiliar, like a building with the scaffolding removed. Lena Voss was changing the dressing on Hector Ruiz's wound. He sat on a crate with his shirt off, and the bandage she peeled away was stained but not soaked, a good sign. Apparently because Lena made a small sound of satisfaction and said, "See, told you I don't lose patients twice in 1 week. You said you'd never lost a patient at all," Hector said. "I said what I needed to say to keep you awake while I was sewing your insides back together. Medical privilege." She placed fresh gauze and taped it down with hands that were steady and sure. And while she worked, she told him a story about her sister's dog. The dog had apparently eaten an entire shoe, not a flip-flop or a sandal, but a full leather boot. And instead of being sick, it had simply walked around for 3 days with a look of deep personal satisfaction. And her sister had only realized what happened when she found the laces in the backyard. The story had no point. It didn't need one. It filled the air the way the chemical light filled the darkness, not because the darkness was dangerous, but Because the warmth was necessary. Colmarsh sat apart from the others. He was at the edge of the light's reach, on an overturned crate with his weapon. Across his knees, the motions were slow, repetitive, mechanical. A cloth dragged along the barrel, a brush worked into the chamber. A click as each part was disassembled and inspected and reassembled. His face had the same expression it always had, that flat, still composure that Vorath at first read as predatory, and now understood as something entirely different. It was the face of a man holding everything at arm's length. Not because he didn't feel it, because he felt all of it, and the distance was the only thing keeping the weight from crushing his ribs. Vorath sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. The chemical light swung. Danny laughed at something the Gren did with the cards. Lena's story about the dog wandered into a second chapter involving a veterinarian who apparently fainted at the X-ray. 800, Marsh said. Vorath looked at him. Coalition lost 800 on the eastern push. Marsh's hands kept on the weapon. Cloth brush click. I did that math before we went in. 800 if it worked, 1,200 if it didn't. 3 to 4 on the draw team either way. His hand stopped. The math was right. His hands didn't start again for a while. Vorath said, I know. Marsh nodded once, a small motion, and stared at the weapon in his lap, and didn't speak again. General Endara summoned Vorath the next morning for a formal debrief. The command platform hummed with residual energy, and Endara's projected form filled the chamber like weather. Vast and ancient and patient in the way that only silicon-based life could be. Patient. Your assessment of the human species. Endara said, for Coalition records. Vorath opened his mouth and found nothing in it. He thought of the words the form provided. Effective, resilient, tactically creative, adaptable, high morale under adverse conditions. Recommended for future deployment. Each word was true, and each word was nothing. You could write those words about a good piece of equipment. I will submit the report tomorrow, Vorath said. He went back to his shelter. He sat with the empty form for a long time. Then he closed the standard template and opened a blank document and began to write. He wrote about the Gren who were born to break things, whose bones were dense and whose muscles were layered, and whose entire biological purpose was to stand in front of something terrible and not move. He wrote about the Ilsari who were made to kill in silence, whose venom could dissolve neural tissue in seconds, who moved through darkness the way water moves through cracks. He wrote about his own Cathar, four-armed carapace-born, shaped by world of predators into beings whose first instinct was combat and whose last thought was always tactical. Every species in the Coalition had been built. Evolution had taken millions of years and spent them like currency, purchasing armor and venom and strength and speed, investing in biological war machines, calibrated to survive the specific horrors of their specific worlds. The humans had not been built for this. The humans were soft, slow by Coalition standards. Their skin tore easily, their bones broke under forces that a Cathar child could generate. They had no venom, no armor, no natural weapons beyond a set of blunt teeth and nails that couldn't scratch a hollow drone's outermost layer. By every metric the Coalition used to Measure a species' combat value, they should have been nothing, cargo, liability, the soft things you step over on the way to the real fight. And they walked into a hive intelligence that consumed civilizations. They walked in knowing they could die. Not in the abstract way that all soldiers know they can die, but in the specific, calculated, mathematically precise way of a species that had measured exactly how fragile it was and chose to go anyway. They felt the fear, not the managed, dampened, trained away fear of the Cathar, but the full, unfiltered terror of creatures who had no evolutionary armor against it. They felt every shade of it, the nausea, the shaking, the tunnel vision, the animal urge to run. And they had learned, across millennia, of surviving things that should have killed them to carry it, to fold without breaking, to bend under the weight and keep walking. Vorlag wrote the final line of the report. I have fought beside creatures that were engineered for war. The humans were not engineered for war. They were engineered for survival. I am beginning to understand that these are not the same thing, and that the second is far more frightening than the first. He submitted the report and walked to the shuttle bay. Danny Prout found him there. The kid looked tired in a way that made his face look both older and younger at the same time, the bones sharper, the eyes softer. The grin was still there, but it sat differently now, like a door that had been rehung slightly off its original hinges. Still functional, just different. Hey, Danny said. Same time next apocalypse. Vorlag did not understand the idiom. He understood the tone, the lightness laid over something heavy, the joke that was not a joke, the human habit of using humor to build a bridge across a gap that serious words couldn't cross. Danny held out his hand. It was small, 5 fingers, no claws, no armor. The skin was soft and slightly rough at the palm, the kind of surface that could be cut by a careless stone. The nails were flat and blunt and good for absolutely nothing. Vorlag took the hand. He wrapped one of his 4 massive claws around it gently, the way you hold something that matters exactly because it can break. And he felt the warmth of it, the blood, heat, the pulse, the small, persistent engine of a body that had no business surviving the things it had survived. Danny grinned. Vorlag gripped the hand tighter. He was learning not to let names go quiet.